Your childhood cartoon memories feature smiling protagonists and sanitized humor approved for general audiences. Yet, during a specific historical moment, when censorship boundaries fractured and counterculture sensibilities invaded mainstream entertainment, something genuinely transgressive emerged from animation studios. These were cartoons deliberately crafted for adults, explicitly forbidden from children's eyes, featuring content so outrageous that modern streaming platforms occasionally restrict them despite decades passing. These films didn't appear on Saturday morning television or in family theaters. They played in late-night screenings, adult bookstores, and select art house cinemas where audiences consciously sought out animated depravity. Most of these films vanished completely from public consciousness, buried beneath layers of corporate sanitization and cultural embarrassment. Yet they remain extraordinarily weird, perpetually shocking, genuinely brilliant explorations of what animation could express when divorced from commercial squeamishness. These 15 cartoons represent cinema's strangest period, when animators abandoned all pretense of family entertainment, pursuing explicit social commentary, sexual imagery, drug references, and violence so graphic that nervous distributors questioned theatrical viability. 1. Lord of the Rings, 1978. Ralph Bakshi's ambitious adaptation of Tolkien's epic represented mainstream animation's most audacious attempt, expanding beyond children's entertainment. Rather than sanitizing Tolkien's complex mythology into friendly adventure, Bakshi confronted philosophical darkness permeating Tolkien's source material. The narrative depicted warfare, corruption, moral compromise, and genuine horror as orcs committed atrocities throughout Middle-earth. Animated sequences employed rotoscope technique, where live-action performers provided movement basis, subsequently traced and enhanced through artistic interpretation. This methodology created distinctive aesthetic, suggesting authentic movement combined with artistic interpretation. The film depicted violence graphically, blood flowing from wounds, corpses strewn across battlefields, warfare's genuine horror contrasting sharply with sanitized fantasy adventure conventions. Bakshi refused romanticizing warfare, instead depicting Middle-earth warfare through unflinching documentation of military brutality. The artistic quality exceeded contemporary expectations regarding animation, sophistication, character development, employing genuine emotional complexity. What made Lord of the Rings genuinely adult-oriented wasn't explicit content, but philosophical maturity. The film treating Tolkien's complex mythology with respect rather than reductive simplification. The narrative refused clear good versus evil demarcation, instead exploring how moral compromise corrupts characters gradually. Various characters confronted circumstances where ethical choices possessed no genuinely positive alternatives, situations where survival required abandoning principles. Bakshi's interpretation suggested that heroism consisted precisely in maintaining moral integrity despite temptation, abandoning it when pressured by circumstances. The incomplete adaptation frustrated audiences. The planned sequel never materialized, leaving narrative suspended mid-story. Bakshi abandoned the project due to budgetary constraints and commercial pressure. Theatrical exhibition shifts prioritizing Star Wars, subsequently limiting fantasy feature distribution. Yet the completed first half remains extraordinarily ambitious, representing a moment when mainstream animation approached sophisticated philosophical narrative without dilution for juvenile audiences. 2. Wizards, 1977. Bakshi's original fantasy creation, Wizards presented post-apocalyptic world where two wizards embodied opposing philosophical frameworks. One wizard pursued traditional magic, mysticism, and spiritual transcendence. The opposing wizard embraced technological advancement and modern civilization. The film depicted genuine warfare between opposing worldviews, where Nazi imagery represented technological modernity's potential for destructive application. Bakshi incorporated actual Nazi propaganda footage into animated sequences, visual juxtaposition suggesting uncomfortable parallels between fascism and technocratic advancement. The film contained explicit violence exceeding typical animated convention, magical battles depicted through bloody confrontation rather than sanitized conflict. The narrative explored adult themes regarding progress versus tradition, technological advancement versus spiritual development, modernity's genuine costs alongside genuine benefits. Rather than presenting clear moral framework, Wizards explored philosophical complexity, suggesting both worldviews possess legitimate strengths and dangerous weaknesses. The film achieved commercial success matching Star Wars' theatrical performance. Yet later, Star Wars' massive popularity forced theater cancellations, Wizards receiving limited subsequent exhibition, destroying box office performance. Yet the film's philosophical ambition remained intact. Bakshi's willingness depicting Nazi imagery and philosophical complexity, suggesting genuine artistic commitment regardless of commercial viability. The film contained moments of surprising beauty, alongside moments of authentic horror, Bakshi maintaining tonal complexity throughout. 3. American Pop, 1981. Bakshi's American Pop presented three-generation chronicle tracing Jewish-American family trajectory throughout 20th century, emphasizing American popular music's evolution from jazz through rock. The narrative employed rotoscope technique extensively, live-action footage providing movement foundation, subsequently enhanced through artistic animation. The film depicted American history through popular music lens, suggesting music represented fundamental expression of contemporary consciousness. Rather than conventional narrative structure, American Pop employed episodic storytelling, where successive generations experienced music's transformative influence. The film contained mature themes regarding family dysfunction, substance abuse, sexual dysfunction, and generational conflict. Characters experienced genuine trauma, informing their relationship with music. Rather than treating music as simple entertainment, Bakshi portrayed music as psychological survival mechanism, helping damaged individuals manage emotional pain through artistic expression. The animation featured distinctive rotoscope aesthetic, where live-action authenticity combined with artistic enhancement, creating unprecedented visual experience. What distinguished American Pop was commitment to depicting authentic American experience, regardless of whether content proved cinematically comfortable. The film depicted addiction genuinely, showing heroin influence across successive generations, suggesting substance abuse represented inherited family trauma rather than moral failure. Characters struggled with addiction because circumstance and family history predisposed them toward dependency rather than because they possessed weak character. Bakshi's compassionate approach toward flawed characters suggested genuine artistic maturity. 4. Heavy Traffic, 1973. Bakshi's semi-autobiographical Heavy Traffic depicted young cartoonist Michael Corleone navigating gritty Brooklyn neighborhood inhabited by bizarre characters embodying urban alienation. The narrative employed live-action framing sequences introducing Michael before transitioning into his inner fantasies, where animation depicted psychological experience. Rather than presenting objective Brooklyn reality, animation expressed Michael's subjective perception. External events filtered through his psychologically distorted interpretation. The film depicted sexual content explicitly, featuring nudity and sexual situations presented graphically without comedic softening. Characters engaged in casual sexual encounters lacking emotional connection or authentic relationship foundation. What distinguished Heavy Traffic from simple sexploitation involved Bakshi's satirical treatment regarding sexual availability without genuine human connection. The film's ultimate argument suggested that abundant sexual opportunity failed providing genuine emotional satisfaction when separated from authentic relationships. Characters craved connection rather than physical satisfaction, their sexual encounters leaving them emotionally unfulfilled despite physical gratification. The animation employed rotoscope technique combined with live-action backgrounds photographed throughout Brooklyn. Bakshi would wander actual streets photographing locations subsequently incorporated into animated backgrounds, creating authentic urban environment contrasting with animated character action. The film received X rating from MPAA, restricting theatrical distribution to adult-only venues. Despite restrictive rating, Heavy Traffic achieved commercial success, proving audiences possess genuine appetite for animated content, addressing adult themes seriously rather than exploitatively. The film demonstrated that animation could accommodate philosophical depth, exploring psychological loneliness and urban alienation without compromising artistic integrity. 5. Fritz the Cat, 1972. Bakshi's Fritz the Cat became cultural milestone, achieving status as first animated feature earning X rating from Motion Picture Association of America. The adaptation transformed Robert Crumb's underground comics into cinematic experience, Bakshi capturing Crumb's satirical approach toward counterculture while expanding visual sophistication. Fritz represented educated adult maintaining philosophical detachment regarding surrounding social chaos, his investigations of various counterculture phenomena providing framework for social satire. The film depicted explicit sexual content, featuring animated characters engaged in sexual acts without comedic distance or suggestive implication. Bakshi presented sexual content straightforwardly, refusing pretending animality prevented human sexuality from manifesting through animated form. The shock value stemmed partly from audiences' unconscious association between animation and childish innocence, explicit sexual imagery violating fundamental cultural assumptions regarding animation's appropriate content. Beyond sexual content, Fritz the Cat contains satirical commentary regarding Vietnam War, governmental authority, generational conflict, and counterculture's increasing incorporation into mainstream commerce. The narrative suggested that original counterculture commitment towards social transformation gradually dissolved into commodified cultural aesthetic, divorced from genuine revolutionary intention. Characters that initially embodied authentic political conviction gradually revealed self-interested motivations, justifying abandon of original principles. Bakshi's cynicism regarding counterculture's trajectory suggested that mainstream culture possessed remarkable capacity, absorbing and neutralizing revolutionary movements through commercialization. The film achieved extraordinary commercial success, grossing $90 million worldwide despite restrictive X rating. The financial success proved definitively that audiences possess genuine appetite for adult animation. Addressing serious themes rather than pretending animation remained exclusively children's entertainment. 6. Coonskin, 1975. Ralph Bakshi's Coonskin represented animation's most controversial achievement, combining live-action narrative framing with animated sequence depicting anthropomorphic animals as Harlem criminals. The film adapted Uncle Remus folklore, recontextualizing Breyer Rabbit, Breyer Fox, and Breyer Bear as contemporary urban hustlers navigating organized crime, police, corruption, and systemic racism. Bakshi deliberately employed racial caricatures as satirical tools examining stereotyping mechanisms within Hollywood representation. Rather than avoiding offensive imagery, Bakshi confronted stereotypes directly, suggesting that deliberately depicting exaggerated racial characterization while simultaneously deconstructing stereotypes represented sophisticated satirical approach transcending simple offense. The film employed distinctive visual aesthetic combining rotoscope animation with live-action footage, creating hybrid presentation, blurring animation reality boundaries. Barry White voiced Brother Rabbit, lending authentic hip-hop sensibility to criminal character. The narrative followed Rabbit, Fox, and Bear climbing organized crime hierarchy while progressively recognizing that street success required accepting exploitation from higher criminal powers. The film suggested that systemic racism created circumstances where marginalized communities lacked alternatives beyond accepting exploitative conditions. Rather than presenting black criminality as moral failure, Bakshi portrayed criminality as rational response to systemic exclusion, providing no legitimate economic opportunity. The film sparked immediate controversy before theatrical release. Congress of Racial Equality protested depicting before production completion. Paramount Pictures withdrew distribution support, forcing independent distributor Bryanston Films to assume theatrical responsibilities. Despite attempts suppressing the film, Coonskin achieved cult status. Contemporary reappraisal recognizing Bakshi's sophisticated satirical intent, transcending initial offense perception. 7. Fire and Ice, 1983. Bakshi collaborated with painter Frank Frazetta, creating fantasy adventure employing rotoscope animation combined with painterly backgrounds. Fire and Ice depicted warrior hero confronting evil ice sorcerer threatening tropical paradise. Rather than straightforward adventure narrative, the film employed philosophical framework, suggesting that opposing elemental forces represented competing cosmological principles. The animation combined rotoscope live-action movement foundation with Frazetta's distinctive artistic style, creating unprecedented visual experience. Frazetta's paintings provided background environment, rotoscoped characters occupying painted landscapes. The visual synthesis created distinctive aesthetic unavailable through conventional animation methodology. What distinguished Fire and Ice involved commitment toward aesthetic innovation, prioritizing visual invention over narrative coherence. The film prioritized spectacular imagery and philosophical symbolism over conventional plot clarity. Extended sequences featured visual spectacle without advancing narrative, Bakshi maintaining commitment toward aesthetic achievement, regardless of storytelling efficiency. The film contained romantic sequences depicting adult attraction between protagonists without sanitization, expected from mainstream animation. Physical intimacy received genuine artistic treatment rather than comedic avoidance. Bakshi suggesting that animation could depict romantic connection authentically, without descending into exploitation. 8. Heavy Metal, 1981. Gerald Potterton's Heavy Metal represented landmark adult animated anthology film, combining multiple animation studios and directorial sensibilities. The film employed narrative framework where sentient spacecraft encounters various civilizations, each segment depicting distinct story, employing different animation style. The connecting narrative possessed philosophical depth, the spacecraft suggesting that technological advancement threatened organic existence through imposing artificial order upon chaotic natural systems. Individual segments achieved remarkably diverse aesthetic and thematic achievements. One segment employed experimental animation, creating surreal psychedelic experience. Another used traditional CL animation. Another employed rotoscope. Another used stop motion. The diversity reflected Heavy Metal's commitment toward showcasing animation's full technical and artistic range. The film contained explicit sexual content, drug references, graphic violence, and apocalyptic imagery reflecting 1980s heavy metal aesthetics. The soundtrack featured legendary metal artists creating music synchronized with animated sequences. What distinguished heavy metal from simple exploitation involved genuine artistic ambition, various directors pursuing distinctive creative visions despite anthology format constraints. The film achieved cult status, audiences appreciating its refusal, compromising toward conventional animation standards. Heavy Metal demonstrated that animation possessed capacity accommodating sophisticated artwork alongside explicit content without descending into juvenility or exploitation. 9. Tarzoon, Shame of the Jungle, 1975. Peach's animated film, Tarzoon, deliberately parodied Tarzan mythology through explicit sexual comedy and crude animation style. The film employed deliberately crude aesthetic, rejecting animation and sophistication, pursuing instead comedic effectiveness through visual simplicity. Tarzoon contained extensive sexual content, explicit imagery presented without narrative justification beyond pursuing shock comedy. The film suggested that animation's primary value for adult audiences involved capacity depicting sexual content unavailable through live-action production. Rather than pursuing artistic ambition, Tarzoon embraced exploitation providing sexual imagery specifically unavailable elsewhere. The crude animation style, intentional rather than technical limitation, contributed toward comedic effect. Crude drawings created visual distance from realistic representation, permitting sexual imagery without realism's uncomfortable implications. The film achieved popularity within specific adult audience demographics seeking explicit animated content regardless of artistic merit. Tarzoon represented animation pursuing purely commercial exploitation, complete absence of artistic ambition or social commentary. 10. Bambi meets Godzilla, 1969. Marv Newland's experimental short, Bambi meets Godzilla, represented early counterculture animation, rejecting conventional narrative expectations. The complete film consisted of approximately 2 minutes footage showing peaceful Bambi grazing before Godzilla's foot crushes everything on screen abruptly. Rather than conventional narrative structure building toward logical conclusion, Newland presented surreal anticlimax, where a parent protagonist receives immediate annihilation. The film contains social commentary regarding unexpected violence, suggesting that comfort, safety, and peaceful existence possessed fragility, threatened constantly by overwhelming destructive forces. The absurdist approach rejected conventional storytelling logic, instead employing shock value, creating unexpected emotional response. Bambi meets Godzilla became cult classic, audiences appreciating experimental approach, abandoning conventional narrative requirements. The film demonstrated that animation could employ short-form shock comedy, effectively communicating philosophical ideas regarding violence and vulnerability. 11. Snow White and the Seven Perverts, 1973. David Grant's adaptation deliberately corrupted classic fairy tale through explicit sexual comedy. Rather than Disney's sanitized version, Grant depicted Snow White engaging in sexual encounters with 7 male characters, providing crude sexual humor without narrative justification. The film employed crude animation style, visual simplicity prioritizing comedic depiction over artistic achievement. The film represented animation pursuing purely exploitative sexual content, complete absence of artistic ambition, social commentary, or intellectual contribution. Grant's film demonstrated lowest-tier adult animation, where sole purpose involved depicting sexual content regardless of artistic merit or creative validity. 12. Quasi at the Quackadero, 1975, Sally Cruikshank's experimental short. Quasi at the Quackadero presented surreal amusement park environment inhabited by bizarre anthropomorphic creatures. Rather than conventional narrative structure, Cruikshank employed psychedelic visual language, creating disorienting experience. The animation employed distinctive visual style, combining traditional seal animation with experimental techniques creating hallucinatory effect. Quasi at the Quackadero contained adult imagery, including nudity and sexual situations, presented through surreal context, emphasizing psychological experience over explicit content. The film's artistic ambition distinguished it from purely exploitative adult animation, Cruikshank prioritizing aesthetic innovation over sexual shock value. What made Quasi genuinely weird involved its commitment towards surrealism, emphasizing subjective, psychological experience, narrative coherence, abandoned pursuing instead psychedelic sensation. The film appealed specifically to artistic sensibility, valuing experimental innovation, audiences seeking animation, transcending conventional commercial parameters. 13. Fritz the Cat, sequel, The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat, 1974. Produced without Bakshi's involvement, The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat attempted capitalizing on original's unexpected success. Rather than matching original's satirical sophistication, the sequel pursued simple sexual exploitation. The narrative provided minimal connecting framework for 9 separate segments, depicting Fritz engaging in sexual encounters. Each segment employed crude animation, sexual content presented graphically without comic sophistication. The film demonstrated rapid decline in adult animation quality subsequent to Fritz the Cat's initial success. Rather than inspiring genuinely artistic adult animation, Fritz's commercial success inspired straightforward exploitation, pursuing sexual content regardless of artistic merit. Contemporary reviewers recognized 9 Lives as inferior sequel, the original's satirical complexity abandoned pursuing instead simple sexploitation. The financial failure of 9 Lives suggested that adult audiences possess genuine appetite for animation containing artistic merit alongside adult themes, rather than simple sexual content. 14. Lupo the Butcher, 1987. Danny Antonucci's adult animated short, Lupo the Butcher presented deliberately crude violence and sexual humor within minimal narrative framework. The animation employed intentionally crude style, rough drawings, and simplistic character design, prioritizing comedic impact over visual sophistication. Lupo the Butcher contained explicit violence and sexual content, presented through shock comedy rather than artistic exploration. What distinguished Lupo, the Butcher, from lowest-tier exploitation involves subtle artistic merit beneath surface crudity. Antonucci's deliberate style choices contributed toward comedic effectiveness, crude visual language enhancing rather than diminishing psychological impact. Despite surface simplicity, Lupo demonstrated genuine understanding regarding how visual language communicated narrative meaning. The film achieved cult status within specific demographic, appreciating shock comedy combined with genuine artistic craft. 15. Hey Goodlookin, 1982. Bakshi's Hey Goodlookin depicted gang warfare in 1950s Brooklyn, narrative following Italian street gang members navigating turf conflicts, romantic entanglements, and eventual maturity. Rather than conventional coming-of-age narrative, Bakshi portrayed adolescent violence and sexual aggression unflinchingly, young characters engaging in rape, battery, and casual cruelty without moral consequences during initial narrative portions. The animation employed rotoscope technique extensively, live-action footage providing authentic movement foundation. The distinctive visual style created visceral experience, suggesting genuine violence rather than stylized choreography. What distinguished Hey Goodlookin involved Bakshi's refusal moral judgment regarding character behavior, violent characters receiving gradual humanization as narrative progressed without explicit condemnation for initial cruelty. This narrative approach suggested that individuals remained capable of genuine emotional development and moral growth despite engaging in appalling behavior when younger. The film contained extensive nudity and sexual situations, physical intimacy depicted graphically without comedic softening. The sexual content contributed toward depicting authentic adolescent experience where sexual desire possessed intensity, overwhelming moral considerations. What made Hey Goodlookin genuinely adult-oriented involved philosophical sophistication, examining violence, sexuality, and moral development through extended narrative framework permitting character development. Rather than depicting violence through shock value, Bakshi employed violence illustrating character psychology, external aggression representing internal emotional damage. The film received minimal theatrical distribution and generally negative contemporary reviews, critics struggling with Bakshi's refusal, providing moral judgment regarding depicted behavior. Yet, subsequent appreciation recognized philosophical depth beneath surface violence. Bakshi's commitment toward authentic character portrayal, suggesting genuine artistic maturity. Which of these genuinely weird cartoons shocked you most, discovering they actually existed? How many of these films created specifically for adult audiences have you actually watched? And how many have disappeared completely from your cultural consciousness? Comment below, revealing which adult-oriented cartoon from the 70s and 80s disturbed you most, whether discovering its existence or revisiting it as adult. Better yet, tell me which deliberately weird adult animation deserves inclusion on this list. Which transgressive 70s or 80s cartoon should have received recognition alongside these already audacious entries? These films represent specific historical moment when animators genuinely push boundaries regarding what animation could express, when adult audiences received animation specifically crafted, addressing their philosophical interests and aesthetic sensibilities. The disappearance of deliberately provocative adult animation represents genuine loss for artistic experimentation. Contemporary animation defaulting toward either children's content or simplified, crude shock comedy. Sound off regarding your experience with 70s and 80s adult animation, because honestly, this era represented animation at its most genuinely weird and artistically ambitious.